Dragon's Dogma 2 is one of the most hyped up game releases of 2024, and from everything we have seen, it appears to be for good reason. A giant open world fantasy adventure that focuses on player agency and customization and just creativity when it comes to the encounters that the world will throw at you. The game looks genuinely brilliant. But there's one hang-up a lot of people have with it, and that is on console, it has an FPS uncapped at around 30 frames per second. Oh boy, here we go again with this discussion. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about frame rate, let's talk about 30 FPS specifically, and how I feel that a lot of the internet tends to get this conversation wrong. Okay, so out of the gate, let's just call it as it is. Dragon's Dogma 2 looks playable. I am not someone to say that 30 FPS means that the game is unplayable. I have played many 30 FPS games throughout my time, and I've enjoyed quite a few of them. I don't think a game's inherent quality rests solely on the idea that it has to have a high frame rate. However, I can admit that realm exists in my mind, and I can also admit that every game is better at higher frame rate. The sole exception that I can think of, or at least remember, would be something akin to, say, the old South Park games, where they had a frame rate in line with the show because they wanted the game to feel like you were playing an episode of the show. For that, it was a stylistic choice, and because of the gameplay mechanisms that South Park had in both iterations, having that lower frame rate wasn't a, well, drawback for the actual gameplay loop because it was turn-based. But that is really the sole exception that I can think of. For any other reason, higher frame rate makes a better game. It doesn't make the game good, mind you, but it makes the game better. Now, let's talk about this, because if you're not, used to this conversation, or you're not used to higher frame rates, this can be a little bit off-putting, a little bit jarring in terms of conversation, because a lot of people miss the mark on why frame rate in video games is so important and so impactful. And some people even go so far as to defend 30 FPS, as if it's a personality trait or something, which I just don't agree with, because in my opinion, if you are actively defending 30 FPS, then you're actively arguing against your own best interest, which seems counterintuitive to me. But again, I've said before, I think games can be good at 30 frames per second. Bloodborne is one of my favorites, even though I haven't beaten it yet. But Bloodborne is a game that plays at 30 FPS, and I love that game. And there's games that are high frame rates that I just don't enjoy that much. But at the same moment, and at the same hand, if Bloodborne was 60 FPS, it would be a better game. Doesn't mean that it's bad in its current state, but it means that the game would be better at 60 FPS, and I assume, well, I don't even need to assume, it would be the same for Dragon's Dogma 2, which is why I'm playing on PC. Now, we have a few things to unpack here. Why is higher frame rate better? Because it's not just a visual thing, and this is why I feel that a lot of people kind of miss the mark in regards to high frame rate, is they assume it just means that the game looks smoother. That's one aspect to it, to be sure, but where I really tell the difference between 30 FPS and 60 FPS is how the game plays. 30 FPS is really slow because you're only seeing 30 frames of the game per second as opposed to 60, which means that the game is less responsive. Now you may be asking, well, Jmulls, why would that be the case? Well, let's think about it logically. That's right, we're going to Microsoft Paint. I actually did this on stream a while back, and it's helped quite a few people understand the concept, so let's do it again. So let's have a timeline, right? Alright, by the way, prepare for an ultimate yap session of epic proportions. So yeah, by the way, if you can't tell, I'm not an artist. Okay, I remade the line because the last one was god-awful, let's be fair here. Let's assume this is 30 frames per second. This is 1 full second here, yeah? Yeah, 1 second. Easy spell there. Now, this is 1 second, and let's assume there's 30 of these hash marks to represent each frame, or whatever it be. Each of these right here is 1 frame. This would be the second frame, third frame, etc., etc. So if I hit the X button somewhere in here, yeah, from here to here, I won't see the result of that, ignoring input delay and animation lag and all that, until the next frame, until here. So if I hit the X button somewhere in here, I have to wait all this time to be able to see the result of that button press. This is a really simplistic explanation of this, by the way. It's a little bit more complicated when you add on stuff like input delay and animation lag and all that, but generally speaking, you have to wait this time until you can see the next frame, because well, your computer has to render it or your console has to render that frame. If we double the frame rate and we make it 60, also again, we're assuming these frames are evenly dispersed. We're going to assume the game was coded remotely competently. So we double the frame rate. If I hit the X button somewhere in here, I only have to wait for the next frame that's available. So instead of having to wait all that time to go somewhere over here, the game renders more frames, so the game is more responsive. And when we go even above 60 frames per second, and we start going into like the realm of 120, 144 frames, well then, you can see how this game becomes far more responsive to my inputs, because I simply have to wait less time to see the result and feel the result of my actions. So the game is more responsive. It's not just a matter of the game appearing smoother, that'll happen as well, assuming these frames are evenly dispersed and I didn't draw the timeline. Assuming that, the game will not only look smoother, it'll play smoother and more responsively. It's why games like fighting games or FPS games that have a lot of high action and quick response times, benefit greatly from a higher frame rate because, well, you can respond quicker. Your inputs get shown to you and the result of them faster. I tend to find though, especially when you play 60 FPS games consistently, when you go back to 30, it really becomes more apparent because you're accustomed to that higher responsiveness of the game. The game just overall being more smooth and responsive than, say, a game at 30 FPS, to where, for a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I tried the visual mode, which is a higher resolution but locked to 30 FPS, and it felt like I'm going through tar compared to performance mode. So that's why I personally prefer higher frame rates for games overall, because, well, they play better at higher frame rates. Doesn't mean a game at 30 FPS is bad, but it just means that if it was a higher frame rate, it would be better. Now, what does this mean for like Dragon's Dogma 2? It's important to note that it's uncapped at 30 for consoles, and this is where an age-old discussion kind of rears its ugly head, and that is the inherent limitations of console gaming. And this is one of the main reasons I really started to prefer PC gaming as of late, because it gives me the ability to tinker and customize the game and the visual fidelity of things, and customize all of it to my preferences, so that I can maybe squeeze out for some more frame rate, which I vastly prefer to visual fidelity, so I get a better gameplay experience. I rock an old rig. I only have like an NVIDIA 1070. It's an old machine, but it's treated me well over the years. So I'm not going to go into Dragon's Dogma 2 anticipating being able to play the game at, say, like 4K, 60 FPS, DLSS, frame generation, all that jazz. I'm not expecting my rig to be able to do any of that. In fact, judging from the minimum spec sheet Dragon's Dogma 2 provided, I may be lucky to squeak out 1080p 30 FPS. But I rock an old machine. When I eventually upgrade my PC, the game will run better, because I'll be able to play it at a higher frame rate and higher resolution. Mainly the frame rate though. But on console, I don't get that option. I am locked to the whims and fancies of what the developers deem I should play the game at, which I don't like. I like having that customization at my fingertips, to be able to tailor make the game to what I want out of it, or to be able to specialize in things that I prefer. I don't mind less visual clarity or visual fidelity if it means I can get higher frame rate up to a point. But I think it's especially unsat that in the year 2024, with the PS5 and Xbox Series X generation of consoles, that we're still having this conversation with certain developers and publishers whether or not a game should at least have a 60 FPS performance mode. We had the same conversation back when Starfield came out, and it's happening again with Dragon's Dogma. Now granted, Dragon's Dogma looks like it's going to be a really intensive game experience, but I still think there should have been an option, no matter how bad the game would look. I still think, especially in this generation of consoles with how strong they are, there should have been an option to sacrifice visual fidelity or certain graphics options for higher frame rate. Because I'm not going to sit here and say you should play a game in a specific way. It's your game. You play it how you want. What I'm arguing and advocating for is that these games should give you the option to play it your way. And if you prefer higher visual fidelity and lower frames, that is your decision. Yes, I did say that games play better at higher frame rates, but you may enjoy a game with higher visual fidelity instead. That is your preference, your decision. You should have that ability as the consumer to make that call. I don't like it when a company steps in and says you should play it this way. That's where I give pushback and where I'm going, okay, slow your roll, hold out, we gotta talk about this. And I feel these conversations can get really heated, where some people try and defend 30 FPS or almost advocate for it because they feel the need to argue on behalf of my corporation, which in my opinion is anti-consumer. You're arguing against your best interest. Sometimes hardware is just outdated, and that's one thing, that's a separate discussion, but for like modern, up-to-date hardware, give the player the option. That's what I'm really saying. So will Dragon's Dogma 2 be a good game? It's looking amazing. I'm almost certain I'm gonna have a massively great time when it comes to Dragon's Dogma 2. Will it run like crap on my machine? Almost certainly. Will I have an even better time eventually down the line if I replay Dragon's Dogma or revisit it at higher frame rate? Oh yeah, absolutely. Does it mean the game's gonna be bad because it's gonna be low FPS on my machine or on a console? No, because good games can be at 30 FPS. But those games are all play better at higher frame rates. There's a separate, also little mini discussion going on here with Dragon's Dogma 2 specifically because it's uncapped 30 FPS, so it's going to be inconsistent. And the IGN previews even had it going down to 24 at times, like anywhere between 24 to 33. And an unstable frame rate can look jarring or jittery, which is a separate kind of like mini discussion. I think they should have absolutely just capped it at 30 or made it so it's consistently 30, because the delta between frames and your responsiveness at those lower frame rates is way more noticeable than say like the delta between 130 frames per second and 140, just because you already have so many frames to work with. Whereas remember the line graph, like the timeline, each of those hashes is bigger, so it's far more noticeable when you gain a frame or you lose a frame, or if the frame rate is inconsistent at those values. Hopefully it's not like too bad, but I'll definitely dig into the PC port on my machine and see if I can somehow squeeze out 60 FPS. I extremely doubt it, but we'll see, we'll see. So yeah, with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, your opinions on the whole FPS situation. Love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, and to hear your perspectives. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.